Yeah, and a microphone will be provided. So we have Thomas and here second row and the lady in the first row there.
Great, thanks for the talks. It was really interesting to hear different perspectives. I suppose, given the title, do I have to say my name or something for the purpose of the...
Yes, please.
Okay, so
yeah, that would be great.
My name's Thomas Tischer. I work with Oxfam. I'm a global program coordinator, working on the long-term development side of things. In speaking and trying to engage more closely with my humanitarian colleagues, which includes two people on the table, or at least formally, Emily, is the question of resilience, which has come up more widely in the development sector. So, in other words, it's not just responding to a crisis; it's preparing for the next crisis. And the resilience penny dropped for me when I read somewhere on some dense document that basically donors and I think a lot of aid agencies are really tired of responding to the consistent crises, say, of in the Sahel region that come up every 2 or 3 years. So crisis, the term suggests that it's something that you never see coming. And it's like, well, most of them you kind of can see coming. They're like heavy shocks in Asia region and slow onset shocks in terms of drought in Africa region. And then there might be global crisis in terms of food price crisis. But you could probably list about 6 major ones which hit more or less regularly in certain parts of the world. And you can think about preparing for them. And that's kind of what the concept of resilience is, and where long-term development and humanitarian crisis response link up, as in building their people's resilience to those shocks. So I was just wondering how you understand that, because a lot of what I've heard so far is responding to crisis and how markets are affected. And I'd like to understand how you think working within market systems and building capacity at local to institutional level can respond to absorbing crisis as they hit. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, Paul-Andre Wilton from CARE International. I was just all the panel really. When we're thinking about markets and the response, and I heard Simon mentioning, bringing back the markets to what was there before, and I wondered whether the shift in thinking is also about changing the markets or bringing them back better. In particular, thinking about gender and how central that is now to the humanitarian agenda, World Humanitarian Summit, first outcome area. What potential is there actually looking at markets to work with women in the supply chains, perhaps not just the visible ones, but using market mapping to go a bit further down the supply chains and empower them so that in the longer term there is more room for them, they are more empowered, they have more authority, more space, more status. So I was wondering if anything came out of the case studies that showed a change in gender attitudes or change in women's position during crisis in markets, or any other thinking around that area would be great. Thank you.
Hi, Sasha Kishenchand. I'm with ITAD, and whatever I ask is not their fault. But I noticed that it was markets in crises. One of the reasons I'm here today is something that's concerned me is what happens after. So there's a term Dr. Lam at the Center for Strategic and International Studies uses, the AIDS tsunami. So you're addressing what happens while we're there, what happens when the poppy palaces are empty, when those little expat restaurants don't have the business anymore. What can we do to make market smart aid effective after we go?
Great, thank you. I would suggest that we group the first and the second question about looking at resilience and looking at what happened after first acute phase of the crisis. Do you want to start, Joe?
Thank you. Good questions. I'm going to be a bit controversial here. I would argue that poor approaches to humanitarian interventions have contributed to crises in the face of shocks in the past, rather than alleviated them. And that there's very important lessons from markets approaches that can point us to why this has been the case, potentially also about how to increase resilience as a result of a crisis, or increase resilience. Concrete examples is this tragedy of dependency that has been created through the development sector. It's one of the obvious ones which markets-based approaches challenge, but yet there still seems to be a huge resistance in actually changing the ways in which not only humanitarian interventions happen, but some of the recovery and then so-called longer-term development programs in crisis-prone areas. So it's a very good point, and I think the answer there definitely lies in some of the lessons from markets-based approaches in development. Application is still, somewhere else to some forthcoming. To answer the question about changing markets, I think that's absolutely the key question here for the longer term. I think one does have to ask oneself, though, given the remit one has, the objectives one has, the time frame that one has, whether or not one is actually interested in changing the market, because maybe there isn't the time, or exploiting the market. Why not? Everybody else exploits it, so why shouldn't development actors know how to exploit the markets in order to deliver what they need to deliver? Whether or not there's evidence of actual changes in the market, I'll leave that for the other panelists who maybe have looked at some of the case studies in more depth.
Thanks. Simon, Veronique, any thought on the aid tsunami or case study illustration?
Yeah, on the case study illustration on gender, we didn't find it, but it was one of the things on our radar, partly because there was an interesting study done by Tufts on Darfur and the impact of a decade of conflict on markets. And they found that certain sectors where men were preeminently the traders, especially in cereals, for example, had now had a change and women were trading more. And that was a result of the market decreasing in size. So as the market became more a small trader market, you see a change between larger traders who tend to be men to smaller traders who tended to be women, suddenly accessing certain commodities that they didn't used to sell. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not sure, and I think that's one of the questions as well. When you see more women on the market, again, you need to ask yourselves why and how and what that means, because it's not necessarily a good sign. Trade, shrinking and becoming, because it becomes a small trader issue, now women are trading in it. I'm not sure that's actually a sign of women being more empowered to the market. So that's something to consider. What happens to market after crisis? I think that's something for me that I found very interesting through the case study research, because in Pakistan, you actually see long-term structural changes due to the crisis and the way aid interacted with markets. And so the actors that used to trade, and some of them are no longer there, even a few years down the line. So it's important, I think, to understand how the crisis has impacted the market and how aid interventions has impacted the market, and for that to be delivered to the next actors working with markets, the development actors, for them to also understand that maybe they were working on markets before through a development lens. The crisis happened. They no longer are dealing with the same types of markets because the crisis has changed and impacted the market. It was also interesting how, almost as market conditions are ready to pick up again, the impact of the crisis on the market, those blockages are still there. So in Mali, I was doing some interviews with traders who used to be from the Gao region, so that's a conflict-affected region of northern Mali, who had been displaced after losing everything to the capital city, to Bamako. And they were monitoring the situation, the market situation back home, wanting to restart businesses. But that issue of credit and having debts was the main blockage for them to go back. And on the other hand, I heard Humanitarian organizations saying, there is less violence, less tension, the conflict has decreased in the region of Gao. We still have this issue, there's nobody on the market. And somehow not linking those two realities together, saying, well, have you talked to the displaced traders? Why are they not going back? Why are they not on that market? And what can you do as a Humanitarian organization to support that? And then what that means for how the structure of the market is changing and how the crisis has impacted the market in the longer term. I'll leave Simon to talk about resilience. I think it's his favorite topic.
Maybe one word on resilience.
One word on Build Back Better.
And then,
if I can, I'll try and avoid resilience. On the idea of building markets back better, I've got to say I am very, very wary about this whole build back better on things like markets, which is not to say that markets can't get better, and it's not to say that we can't sometimes have an eye on how we can improve gender power relations in markets and so on. If we are talking about indulging in social engineering experiments at a time when people are desperately in need of humanitarian aid, I might suggest that it's an inappropriate time to be talking about that. Can we get the markets working first, get people's lives, whatever, so that humanitarians can go home, because the urgent needs are no longer there. And then, if social engineering is kind of fine, but if it goes wrong and people are in a crisis, I'm not sure that's the right time. And this is not only about markets. I mean, we do it all the time. The one I used to get angry about, seeds and tools distributions, is like, oh, we've got all these so-called improved seeds that farmers have refused to plant for the last 50 years. Now that they're starving and have got nothing else, I can finally force them to do it, which is basically what we do, yeah? And of course they fail because they're not right for the area. And it does seem to me that is the absolute one time when you shouldn't be messing about with too new stuff. The other thing is I think markets are just so... The reason, I guess, why the state-planned economic model didn't do very well in the end compared to the market model, for all its faults and imperfections, is that markets are just faster than we can possibly plan and think. Because the market is this kind of mechanism whereby if you've got a country of 10 million people, then there's 10 million decisions being made, and everyone can respond to price signals and change what they're doing and so on. And the idea that we can kind of sit in, whether it's a UN office or an NGO office or a donor office, and kind of second guess all of this, plan for it and do it better, I think, I'd be a little bit careful about doing that in a crisis. Is that enough?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm gonna direct the next question to you, Emily. So that's a question from Emily Sloan online, working with the IRC. So basically, the question is, you mentioned about all those great market assessment, market analysis tools that have been around for quite some time now. So what do you think explain the persistent skills gap among humanitarian practitioners in market analysis? And what do you think, because that would be too easy, but the follow-up question is, how do you think we can build capacity in an effective way? So maybe Emily suggests that maybe the old method needs some tweaking. And there is a second question building on Emily's one from Isham Kogali, who is an independent consultant based in Geneva, who's basically asking that there are many small-scale independent market assessments that have been done, but to reach scale, it seems there need to be a coordinated approach to market assessment. So do you have any thought about, does anyone do this in crisis? And if not, who should be in charge of doing it?
Okay.
Easy.
Okay, so the question of Emily on what is the skill gap and how to build capacity in an effective way. Okay, I think the provocative answer is there is no skill gap. It's just we need to bring other people in. Maybe it's more nuanced than that, but I think within the humanitarian sector, we can expand the skill set of people who have the background to do livelihood analysis of needs, analysis of context. I would imagine that you can expand that, but I don't think that we should get every single person in an NGO or in a humanitarian agency able to assess markets. So I think, and I know this has been discussed, but in terms of the way we do capacity building, maybe we have to accept that a lot of it is not capacity building, it's just awareness raising, and it's just getting people to understand the why and adopt the idea that, you need to understand markets just because they are part of people's lives and therefore part of people's lives during the crisis. So I would consider that the key issue is not in the skill gap in humanitarian, is how do you bring the other skills? And how do you make sure that actually in a humanitarian crisis, you don't only have one humanitarian whoever running around and trying to follow the money and go up and down the chain. okay? Because this is what happens in most of the cases. So building capacity, I would think we have what is needed, but let's bring the other people. That would be my sort of main point. The second question is fraying me because actually it's going much. So the question on how to go from small scale to a bigger scale and coordination. We have been pulling our hairs on how to coordinate cash. So I think we are touching here into a bigger question on markets. To me, a question of how in the humanitarian sector we manage to coordinate, integrate, and also have a bit more of cost efficiency and cost effectiveness. So ideally, okay, I'm going to give my vision so that we can figure out later on in the pub how to get there. Ideally, we would have, okay, somebody said, the crises happen in places where we know already, yeah? Vast majority, we know where they will happen, we know more or less how they will look like, give or take. So ideally, we would have market mapping and modeling of risk within that market mapping before the crisis in the areas where we know that it will happen at some point. And we would do that probably, hopefully, as a coordinated sector or a group of people who are empowered to do it for the sector. Models can be discussed. And when the crisis happens, then we just update that. And we try to be not too much behind the curve. I think that would be the ideal.
Thank you. Anybody else on the coordination of market assessments or market-based programming, if you want to broaden up a bit the topic?
Well, I think there's something that Emily said earlier that I think is critical, is how market analysis is, she said the tools are there and we have the right tools to know what we need to know, but often market analysis are done and recommendations not implemented. And I like this idea of awareness raising, I think, and that's something that's been discussed in the sector, how the response analysis then happens and what actually is put in place following a market analysis, and how do we empower decision makers, managers to actually implement the recommendations of market analysis. And I think that's something that's quite important also to, and the sector is a bit stuck at, we know these things about the markets, now how do we actually intervene so that we work in ways with the market, to the market, so that the end game, which is the crisis affected people, are better off and not dependent on aid.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's we are learning a bit from the cash agenda, right? And the question is probably around where do we put the incentives so that at the end of the day there is no other solution than to take into consideration the recommendations of the market assessment and so on. So maybe this is where we need to be thinking now.
Great, thanks. I'm going to open the floor for a new round of questions from the audience. So we got 2 people here, and anybody from this side? No? Okay, 3.
I'm independent consultant. To start off on a positive, I suppose there are models of common assessments being done. ACAPS would be one in the humanitarian field, and it would be quite easy, I would have thought, to extend the work they do, or an organisation like them can do in market assessment in crises. They're good at it. They have a large field. They don't do markets at the moment, they do humanitarian assessments. But there is a body recognised that does that. Secondly, right, I'm a little disturbed. I've been in this business even longer than Simon's been talking about cash, and still there seems to be a mismatch between where people stand and how they're prepared to compromise. Humanitarians have been missing development people for years, and development people have been missing humanitarian people for years. There's about understanding the premise from which people come from. Now, I only read fairly quickly the South Sudan report, but nowhere in that, talking about humanitarian situation, was there even a discussion or a hint of the humanitarian imperative and so on. And it is a very real question, even though Simon, I hope, exaggerates it for emphasis. But if you have people, particularly in acute crisis, how do you make a decision between a market analysis and feeding somebody today? And that, much as you may scoff at it or whatever, that is the very real type of decision that's going on. And so the question then is how you integrate it, how you trust it, and how we talk about it. And we won't get that conversation going without people talking about it and understanding other people's perspectives and where they're coming from. So please, when you're talking about it, will you talk about the humanitarian imperative? Because that's what counts in those situations. You can't naively say it doesn't, and you can't naively say the humanitarian system does not react how we think it is. It isn't what we think it ought to be. It is what it is. It's where we all have to function and where we all have to make the best of it. And if you stand separate and say, it's not how I think it should be, therefore I'm not going to engage with it, nobody's going to listen to it, you're not going to get your point across, you're not going to make the change, which I think are very real, very positive changes, they're not going to be made. So there is a change of the whole framing of the debate. Please.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the gentleman just next to you had a question as well.
Thank you. Andy Seal from UCL. It's a question really for Joe, I think. Of course, economists are famous for failing to predict how markets are going to behave. And every decade we need a new economic theory to predict why it didn't work out how it was supposed to be. So bearing that in mind, I wondered what this paradigm shift would look like. How would we get there? What will it be like? And referring to Emily's point, I'm surprised that people think there wouldn't be a skills gap to enable us to do that.
Thank you. And yeah, there was a question from the back here.
Hi there, Lauren, I'm a student. My question is for anyone who wants to answer. Do you think that there is hope for market accountability within the current humanitarian system when some of the significant donors, implementers, and thus perpetrators are global agenda-setting organizations? And secondly, is there potential for existing coordination and accountability mechanisms, for example, the cluster system, to be strengthened and then to have some influence on market smart aid?
Great. Thank you. No, we are good in terms of question. Great. So looking maybe at the first question on should ACAPS or other body that are implementing multi-sector assessment look at market analysis, is it okay if I ask you to follow up on this, Emily?
Okay. I don't think I don't have an answer to that in the sense I am no one to judge who is best placed. But yeah, absolutely, it's something to be considered. What is out there, what works, and if it can take it on board. Sorry, I won't say more.
No, it's no, it's fine. Simon or Veronique, do you have also a word?
On the common models, I'm not sure that at the moment what we need is a common model. I think what we need at the moment is a shared body of knowledge. And I think at the moment we haven't got that very well. I don't think there's anything wrong in the multiplicity of different ways of... I mean, if we only had one economic model to study the world, I mean, even with all of the ones that we've got, we still don't... None of them will still forecast the next crash, you know, as you said. But at least we've got several, and then we can then kind of cobble together hybrids to explain what happened last year. And if we decided through a UN bureaucracy what the one model should be, I don't think we'll be doing a service to anyone. What we do need is a shared body of knowledge, and we don't have that. I mean, a slight sort of generalization, caricature, but I think only slight, is that on the whole, development economists, market economists have tended not to look at crises because that's where their economic models tend to break down and where you can't get the good data and so on and so forth. We know that. Humanitarians haven't looked at markets until now because they've been too busy looking at people. And that is changing. I think both of those two statements are changing rapidly. And there are a few really, really good and really interesting studies on changes that happen to markets in crises, and they tend to have been done by country specialists, if you want. I mean, you've got people, I mean, I can say that the stuff that I find really, really interesting is like Margie Buchanan-Smith. She's been working in Darfur for 30 years or something like that. She studied markets there. And people like Adam Payne, who's been in Afghanistan probably even longer. Fascinating stuff. But it's not a sort of a shared body of knowledge around markets in crisis. I think if we had that with lots and lots of different models, that might actually get us going forward. Very briefly on the humanitarian imperative. Yeah, I know I did kind of sort of hype it up a bit, but actually, our paradigm is that the humanitarian imperative, humanitarian response, emergency response is urgent. If you like, that is what defines it. And let's face it, we're kidding ourselves and we're kidding everybody else, because it very rarely is urgent. In the sense that the vast majority of humanitarian action takes place in crises which have been going on for years. Even, I mean, someone talked about the AIDS tsunami. Tsunamis are really very, very rare in humanitarian response. And even when there is a tsunami, it's only kind of urgent and sudden and quick for 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, you've had 2 weeks to get someone in to look at markets. If 2 weeks is too quick, fine. A month, you know, whatever you want. But the idea that I'm always chasing my tail, I don't have time to understand the market, I don't buy it. Because yes, in the first week of a crisis, there's something more important to do. Yes. By the second week in the crisis, the odd time when the airport is too blocked with bringing in, come on, how often is that the case that you can't bring in someone to think, find someone to talk to? I know the agencies are in Nepal. The first people on the plane, they found local market experts to talk to who helped them to try and understand it. Kind of, how many babies die as a result of me taking an hour off to talk to? Come on, guys, let's not go there. I mean, yeah. So, yes, the humanitarian impact. Yes, we do need to understand each other, and we do have different ways of looking at the world, which is the reason why we set up conversations like this, and we're all going to the pub afterwards. I hope you'll all join us, where we're getting hopefully people from every side to try and not solve everything, but at least to understand why it is we have different languages and different perspectives and so on, and how can we better collaborate. But I think that we, on all sides, we create our own idealized image of what we do, which entrenches those differences. And if we actually took a really hard look at what we do, and what we do quite rightly, I don't think it often conforms to those idealized images.
Joe, would you like to follow up on the question that was directed partially to you from UCA about economists and what should mind shift look like?
What should the paradigm shift look like? I love the confidence you place in me to provide a new paradigm today. Obviously, I don't quite have that paradigm. Maybe I could have a look if I've written it down in the bus coming over. But I think for me, the question is, how do we actually get there? And I only have a few ideas as to where we might start looking at where that paradigm shift might come from. I'd start with funding structures, or the way in which aid is funded, which is a market in itself. And also in that whole concept of a mind shift. I kind of think we're stuck. We're even stuck with the markets language, stuck with thinking about markets as marketplaces or somewhere where food and stuff is traded. And we've mentioned credit markets. Thank goodness we are looking more and more into financial markets. What about information? What about communication? These are markets as well. And just this morning, I think it was on Al Jazeera, I'm not sure where, I saw a new innovation, which I think that's the kind of space we need to be looking at. That WFP, believe it or not, actually has launched. I think it's a new app that allows anybody in this room to provide food to a Syrian refugee child. I don't know how it works, but I think it's kind of neat. It's kind of neat in looking in new spaces to innovate new ways in providing solutions. So I think that's opened up an interesting segue for a comment. But I think that's, for me, where we need to be looking somewhere completely out of the box. And how do we do that? Great. Simon, I think you...
No, but that's better I don't.
Shall we bring this broader question to the pub, maybe? How do we do this? The last question I'd like to put out there for the panel is the question from Lauren about how to fit market analysis, but maybe like broader market-based programming into the cluster system. Who's up for it?
Wow. Well, in a sense, the last age, there will be no clusters. If market analysis brings in the last age, why do I say that? I mean, we've got this fantastic, I've got an opportunity now to rant about something I like ranting about, which is this wonderful term. No, yeah, only a 2-minute rant. We hand out cash to people because we realise that's the best thing to do, but we can't free ourselves from having our own objectives, even though the whole reason for giving cash is to allow people to meet theirs. So we've come up with this fantastic new invention called multi-purpose cash. Yeah, unlike the single-purpose cash that the rest of us deal with. What is multi? Yeah, so our language doesn't allow us to let go. Even when we're giving cash, the whole purpose of which is to free people to do, respond to their own individual needs, take advantage of their own individual opportunities. We can't let go. We have to manage ourselves by our objectives, because that's what effective programming is. It's defined as meeting my objectives, not helping people to meet their objectives. And the cluster system, that's how we do. We break their world into our world, and we call it clusters. Well, if we're actually going to go for the last age where it's all about markets and understanding their context and so on, and where basically we don't give people stuff anymore, which can be clustered, we support people to meet their needs in lots and lots of different ways, does the cluster system not evaporate in a puff of green smoke? Possibly. There might still be room for some. I mean, let's face it, the cluster system was only invented 10 years ago. I mean, this idea that the humanitarian system, we have to accept it because it was handed down like the Bible from, well, whichever religion you are, that's where your Bible comes from. It isn't. We created it, we've adapted it. The cluster system is 10 years old. We could get rid of it and have a completely different one after next year's World Humanitarian Summit if we really want. If we sing loud enough, we can bring about change. So we might need a few clusters, maybe protection will be slightly different from the rest, I suppose. There'll be protection and there'll be material, and there's 2 clusters. And then, I suppose, markets largely belong in one, or we could make it cross-cutting. Was that 2 minutes?
Yeah, and I'm going to give you 2 more minutes.
No, that's not 2.
for the yeah.
I just wanted to add 1 or 2 points, but on the other questions. Just
Sure.
a point of clarification. When I said I don't think there is gap in skills, I was talking about humanitarian. And I don't think the biggest gap is there. This is what I meant. On the humanitarian imperative, I really want to react to that one, because I think this is exactly what we're saying. We are saying to reach the humanitarian imperative, we need to understand markets. If you give cash to people and they cannot buy the food, or you give them food and actually what they need is something else and they have to sell it, then you're actually not reaching the outcome, not addressing the needs. So I think it's very critical to say the whole point of all of this is ultimately for people to be able to survive, live. That's the whole point. So I think it's very critical to say so. After, how do we do it so that we are not waiting 2 weeks before we actually respond to the needs? That's for us to get very organized and for us to do to work on preparedness, etc. So unfortunately, the sector is sufficiently sophisticated, or maybe too much, so that we have a lot of people doing different things at the same time, so we kind of manage these things in parallel. But I think it's very important to say that that's the whole point, is to go back to what people need and to the humanitarian imperative. The point on accountability, I think, is fundamental. And actually, the work on market is bringing us to more philosophical questions of where do we put the money? When we buy, as you were saying, who do you reinforce or who you don't? How do you redistribute wealth through the humanitarian market? So accountability is critical. Though I think the question is bigger than this, so we could have a whole panel on accountability in the humanitarian system, but absolutely one that we need to keep in mind.
Thank you. There is a big appetite for more debate in the room, which I'm not going to allow now, but there is a pub event which is starting at 4, which I'm encouraging you to join. If you want, I'm going to give you the detail of this. I just want to give each of you 1-2 minutes for final thoughts around 2 questions. So the first question is the question of today: what happened to market in crisis? And the second question is a question we receive from an online participant. So we receive it from Alexandros Yiannopoulos for Oxfam International. And the question is a very challenging one. It's about how much do you think market-based approaches challenges the present humanitarian system, and do we have how much it changed the way we work as humanitarian? So you want to start, Veronique? Yeah.
I think what happens to market in crisis is not so much a key question, but the fact that markets are relevant for people's lives and livelihoods and the people that humanitarians are trying to support. So they should be important and relevant for humanitarians, and I think that's the bottom line. How much do the market-based approach challenges the system? I think it doesn't. I think it reinforces the system, and it's actually quite incredible, as Simon was saying, to see how through the use of cash, market assessment, market analysis has made such a headway within the humanitarian sector. And definitely today, and through the research that we've done, the sector is going in the right direction when it comes to market sensitivity, market awareness, market-based interventions. It needs to go that step further to really have an impact and an outcome, but it's going there, and I think that's something that's very positive. We often talk about the negative sides of humanitarian actions and the humanitarian sector. I think the discussions around markets are positive discussions, and it's going in the right direction.
Thank you. Joe?
Thank you. Good question to finish off on. I think also that the markets-based approaches really uphold a lot of the principles of the humanitarian sector. They do start to challenge the how, but the fundamental, what we're trying to achieve, I think markets approaches can uphold, namely to provide people with the dignity to make a choice, the freedom to be able to express that choice and decide for themselves.
Thank you. Yeah, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, to reinforce your point, I think what happens to markets in crisis is just what happens to people in crisis. That's fundamentally the point. In terms of how I think market-based approaches challenge the humanitarian system, I think a great deal, and for the best. I think this is reminding us that we have created a sort of nest in which we call ourselves the humanitarian sector, but it's reminding us that we live in a much bigger world where there are actually also opportunities, not only threats. So I think it's helping us to replace ourselves in a much bigger perspective, and that we need to call upon other skills and work with others and put ourselves in other contexts. So for me, there is a huge opportunity there. It's a slow work. So my question is still, how do we get this to a much more strategic and political discussion? How do we get it out of a conversation with the same usual suspects?
Thanks. Simon?
Yeah, do market approaches challenge the humanitarian system in any way? Practically, the answer may turn out to be no, because we might come up with a markets cluster and carry on doing business as usual, and we'll have all our normal programming, and we'll have markets programming, which is what we've done for lots and lots and lots of other things, yeah? If we take them seriously, I think they completely challenge us overwhelmingly and totally and completely in every possible way. First of all, they challenge the way in which we think about the people who we're supposed to be there to help. Because if you're thinking about markets and market activity, you're thinking about them as being active economic agents. Vulnerable, yes, but vulnerable as active economic agents with their own needs, their own lives, and making their own choices. No longer just as passive victims. It changes that. It changes our operational paradigms, because markets, and this is what comes out, this is why, I mean, maybe I'm just a geek, but I love the nuts and bolts of how markets change in different countries. These details are fascinating, and because they're different from country to country, if you're not embedded and don't know culturally and economically and institutionally how it all works in that specific place, then you can't do anything. But our operational paradigms are all about, I'm a humanitarian expert, wherever there is a crisis, send me in and I will know how to deal with the sector. Completely and totally undermined by a market-centred approach. It undermines completely our notion of accountability. At the moment, I am accountable for making sure that X number of people get X tons of food, 3 wells, 5 schools, whatever it is. The moment you're into a market, you can't hold me responsible for anything. Because what people do will depend upon, first of all, what they choose to do, but also what everybody else in that economy chooses to do. So, and it's a real difficulty. I have to be able to hold myself accountable, never mind being held accountable by my boss. I've got to know, am I doing the right thing? But I can't possibly know what that is, this whole word complexity and all the rest of it. Absolutely fascinating. Our notions of accountability go out the window. Our notion of what the system is has gone out the window. Because for as long as we're handing out stuff, the people who hand out stuff are the system, plus the ones who pay for it. And then we're all about contractors, they're not really. Oh, we'll call it a partnership and then they can be part. Yeah. The moment it's the market and people's economic lives, everything is the system. There is no longer a humanitarian system in the same way. We can't think of it as a system. And if divides break down, and if we don't have a skills gap because we're bringing skills from other people who just come in to help us and then go out again, are they part of this? So our whole notion of our own little self-contained system has gone out the window. And finally, it challenges us in the most important way possible. Completely undermines our own vested interests. Because if we're going through markets and we define our jobs by, I work for the agency that hands out shelter, and I work for the agency that hands out food, and I work for the agency that hands out things for children, mentioning no names. And all of that's now gone, then the whole vested interests, our whole institutional and personal vested interests are challenged. So I suppose the answer to that, do they challenge us? The short answer would have been yes.
But maybe there is no short answer to this question as well.
I'm answering a question, the referees.
Great. So we're gonna wrap up this bit of the afternoon. So I'd like to thank you very much for your participation online, in the room, of course, in the panel. Video recording of the event will be available in a few days on ODI website. And if you haven't had enough of markets or not enough of beer, we would like to encourage you to join us at the Mad Hatter Hotel Pub, which is apparently just around the corner. So it's Stamford Street, 37 Stamford Street. I'm sure you know better than me where that is. But just follow the crowd. Okay, that's...
Down to the lights and turn left. That's Stamford Street, yeah? I don't know the pub. Towards the river and then turn left at the traffic lights is Stamford Street.
Ask the Londoner then. And so the debate in the pub, because that's the whole point, not just to share drinks, will be on how to best approach markets as humanitarian practitioner with the development crowd. And they will be with us at the pub. Thank you very much, and see you there.